The climb didn't start at the trailhead. It started in the elevator of the oncology wing a few months ago. That was when the silence first changed. It became heavy, a physical thing that sat on their chests. When they finally stepped onto the silver path that morning, the weight came with them. Eli led the way, his boots rhythmically striking the granite. He hiked with a grim intensity, his eyes locked on the ascent. For Eli, the mountain was an opponent he could understand. You breathe, you step, you endure. There are no hidden cells, no microscopic betrayals in the rock. Keep your heart rate steady, Eli called back, though his own voice was tight. Don't let the rhythm break. Behind him, Jonah moved with a grace that seemed fragile. He was thin, thinner than he'd been at Christmas, and his breath hitched in the thin air. Every time he paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, the rest of them instinctively slowed, though they pretended to be looking at the view or adjusting their packs. The unspoken rule of the hike was simple. Nobody asks if he's okay. Thomas stayed at the rear, acting as the anchor. He carried the heaviest pack, loaded with the wood they'd gathered at the lower tree line and that expensive bottle of bourbon. He cracked jokes that landed like lead, comments about Eli's drill sergeant energy and Mara's city girl hiking boots, but his eyes never left the back of Jonah's jacket. He was watching for the telltale wobble, the moment when the warrior persona Jonah was wearing might crack. Mara walked between them. The bridge. She watched the way the light changed from the harsh clinical white of the morning to the bruised purple of the late afternoon. She remembered when they used to hike for the gram, for the peak bagging rides, for the beer at the end. Today, they weren't hiking toward a destination. They were hiking away from a countdown. By the time they reached the shepherd's cabin, the sun was a dying ember. The river below was a silver thread, and the mountains rose up like the walls of a cathedral. They were exhausted, their muscles screaming. But as Jonah dropped his pack and looked out over the valley, a spark of the old light returned to his eyes. "We made it," Jonah whispered. It wasn't a boast, it was a relief. Eli checked his watch, but for the first time all day, he didn't announce the time. He just nodded and began clearing a space for the fire. The civilization they were leaving behind felt 1,000 miles away, buried under the layers of pine and stone. The fire was Thomas's idea. He'd said it like a joke when they reached the river. If we're going to say goodbye to civilization, we should at least do it properly. But none of them had laughed. The humor felt too thin for the altitude. Now the mountains rose behind them like dark teeth against a sky bleeding gold and violet. Mara watched the light catch in the river's bend and tried to remember. The last time the four of them had been alone together without phones buzzing or someone checking the time, it had been before the diagnosis, before the word malignant had sucked the air out of every room they shared. Eli poked at the fire, sending a brief spiral of sparks upward. He had always been the practical one, the one who mapped the route, who booked the cabin when he learned what was happening, who insisted they hike the final stretch on foot. "If we're going somewhere meaningful," he'd said, "we should earn it." But watching him now, his hands were shaking slightly. He wasn't just tending a fire. He was trying to keep the darkness at bay. Jonah sat cross-legged, sleeves rolled to hide the hospital bracelet he still hadn't taken off. He looked smaller out here, his frame hollowed out by the first round of tests, but somehow steadier. The orange light carved new lines into his face. Yet the smile he gave them was the same reckless one from their college days. "I wanted this view," Jonah said softly, his eyes fixed on the jagged peaks. "Something bigger than all of it." "It makes the hospital feel like a dollhouse," Thomas whispered, leaning back against a log. "All those machines, all those beeps, they don't mean anything to a mountain." Jonah looked down at his wrist. The white plastic band was a jagged contrast to the organic browns and greens of the forest. It was a reminder of schedules, dosages, and next steps. It was a label that said, "patient" instead of "friend." Without a word, Jonah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folding knife Eli had lent him. He slipped the blade under the plastic. Snip. The white band fell into the dirt. Jonah didn't throw it in the fire. That felt too dramatic, too much like a movie. He just let it lie there in the dust, a piece of trash left behind by a man who was, for the first time in months, just a man. "There!" Jonah said, his voice stronger. "I'm back." Mara reached for the tin mugs and poured the last of the coffee they'd carried up from the valley. The steam rose to meet the cold mountain air. They had come because time had grown sharp, because once, years ago, they had sworn that if life ever cornered one of them, they would find a wild place and sit together until the fear felt small. Tonight they weren't waiting for a phone call. They weren't waiting for a prognosis. They were just four friends suspended between what had been and what would come. The temperature dropped with the sun, the kind of mountain cold that bites through wool and settles in the marrow. Thomas reached into his pack and pulled out a heavy glass bottle, wrapped in a thick wool sock. He unwrapped it with the reverence of a priest handling a relic. "Pappy Van Winkle," Eli whispered, his eyes widening. "Thomas, that bottle costs more than my first car. Where did you even find that?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He unscrewed the cap, the seal breaking with a sharp, definitive crack, the scent of caramel, charred oak, and something ancient wafted into the cold air. He poured a generous measure into each of the 4 tin mugs. "I didn't find it," Thomas said, his usual smirk nowhere to be found. "I've had it in the back of my liquor cabinet for 3 years. I was saving it for my wedding, or maybe when I finally made partner." He handed a mug to Jonah, then Mara, then Eli. "But last Tuesday," Thomas continued, looking into the fire instead of at them, I realized I was holding on to a someday that doesn't exist. We spend so much time waiting for the right moment to be happy, or the right moment to say the big things. And then the world shifts an inch, and you realize you're just standing in a room full of expensive dust. He raised his mug. The orange light of the embers danced in the amber liquid. "I'm not Toastmaster material," Thomas said, his voice cracking just a fraction. "But I realized I didn't want to drink this with a wife I haven't met yet, or a boss I don't even like. I wanted to drink it with the people who knew me when I was still an idiot in a dorm room. I wanted to drink it with the guy who's going to beat this, and the 2 people who are going to help him to do it." Mara looked at the liquid in her cup. It felt heavy. "You bought this for us?" "I bought it because I was terrified," Thomas admitted, finally looking at Jonah. "I was terrified that if I didn't open it now, I'd be drinking it alone one day, wishing I hadn't been so stingy with the good stuff." The admission hung in the air, raw and jagged. It was the first time any of them had openly acknowledged the possibility of a one day without Jonah. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was the truth, served neat. Jonah took a sip. He closed his eyes as the warmth bloomed in his chest, a sharp contrast to the cold wind whistling through the cabin's gaps. "It tastes like time," Jonah whispered. "Thank you, Thomas." They sat in a silence that was no longer heavy, but shared. The bourbon didn't make the cancer go away, but it made the circle around the fire feel unbreakable. For a few minutes, the only sound was the wind and the soft clink of tin against tin. The fire had settled into a pulsing rhythmic glow, the heart of the beast, Thomas used to call it when they were kids. The wind had picked up, a high-altitude whistle that searched for gaps in the cabin's weathered timber. Inside, the 4 of them huddled on the rough-hewn floorboards, wrapped in sleeping bags, and the lingering warmth of the bourbon. The big fear, the one with the medical name and the survival statistics, was still there, but it had grown tired of standing in the center of the room. It had retreated to the corners, leaving space for the smaller things. "I'm not afraid of the treatment," Jonah said suddenly. He was staring at a knot in the ceiling beam, his voice clear in the dark. "I'm afraid of the hospital soup. I'm afraid of that specific shade of beige they paint the waiting rooms. It's the color of boredom and bad news." A small, surprised laugh escaped Mara. "You always hated beige. You used to say it was the color of a life without seasoning." "It is," Jonah whispered. "I'm afraid I'll forget what the air smells like after a thunderstorm, because I'll be stuck in a room where the air is filtered through a machine. I'm afraid of losing my place in the world's rhythm." Eli, who had been obsessively checking his pack for the 3rd time, finally stilled his hands. "I'm afraid of the phone," he admitted, his voice low. "Every time it rings now, my heart does this weird stutter. I'm afraid of the silence after I answer it." Thomas sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to deflate his chest. I'm afraid I'm going to be the same guy I was before this. I'm afraid that once we get down from this mountain, I'll go back to caring about my quarterly reviews and my LinkedIn profile. I'm afraid of being shallow again. Mara reached out, her hand finding the rough fabric of Jonah's sleeping bag. We all have them, the small ghosts. Mine is the grocery store. I go to buy milk and I see the Get Well cards in the aisle, and I just stand there until someone asks if I'm okay. I'm afraid of the pity in people's eyes. They sat with those admissions for a long time. It was a strange sort of exorcism. By naming the small fears, the beige paint, the ringing phone, the shallow life, the big fear felt less like a monster and more like a shared burden. "We should make a new pact," Jonah said, his eyes catching a stray glint of starlight from the window. Not just no one goes into the dark alone, but no one goes back to being the person they were before the dark. "I can do that," Eli said. "Me too," Mara whispered. Thomas just nodded, his hand tightening around his empty tin mug. The mountain didn't offer an answer, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of the things they hadn't said for months, the messy, unheroic, human parts of being scared, as the moon climbed higher, casting silver shadows across the cabin floor. The dark teeth of the peaks outside seemed to soften, guarding them while they finally slept.